Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Max Eden is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the author of many books and articles on education policy.
Well, welcome to our audience. I'm Larry Mead, a professor at NYU. We appreciate your interest in this very important subject. We're talking about culture, which we mean here how people think life's about. What is it that we seek to do and be in our time? And that is a broad meaning, but it turns out to be a crucial issue for America. The presumption in my book, and we'll talk about this, is that America is culturally divided. We have a dominant culture that came from Europe, which is individualist in character. I'll come back to that. But we also have a number of groups in the country also who are from elsewhere, who do not come from Europe, who come from other parts of the world. And the basic idea is that they have different views about life. In the European view, life is about pursuing one's personal goals. Essentially, life is inner-driven. People do the things that they decide to do. On the other hand, they also have moralistic ideas about right and wrong. And these ideas operate to force them to be attentive to other people's needs as well. So it's a combination of an assertive culture that at the same time is moralistic about right and wrong. Now, the non-Western groups have a much more cautious culture where life is about adjustment to outside pressures rather than seeking change. Generally, these groups are not so aware of themselves as individuals, but as members of a group, and they seek to get through life without necessarily pursuing personal goals. And their ideas of right and wrong are more situational. They tend to identify with what other people expect them to do. So what is moral is what is set in your context and situation rather than general principles. Now, two other important points. First of all, there's no notion here that the Western individualist culture is superior in any general sense. On the contrary, both cultures have strengths and weaknesses. They're good at some things, not good at other things, and we definitely will discuss that. And also, these cultures have no necessary tie to race. We tend to assume, and that's descriptively true, that most people from the non-Western world are not white. But in the view of the research, which I'm relying on here, that's irrelevant. There is no necessary reason why non-white groups have the culture they do, or that the European groups have a different racial makeup. That really isn't important. What is important is that they're culturally different. Okay, now having described that basic contrast, let me get Max's reaction.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me on, Larry. I mean, I think as I read the opening of the book, as I listened, to you to recap it, the term that comes to mind that I think is worth, discussing with you, unpacking a little bit. I'm curious, frankly, if come across your radar because it's in some ways a product of kind of internet subculture. The term is celebration parallax. Have you heard this term?
So no, I haven't.
So the celebration parallax is a kind of like political linguistic phenomenon where a pattern of facts is either true and glorious or false and scurrilous, depending on who is describing them.
Yeah.
And so the interesting thing as I, hear you describe this is that in many ways it is relatively fairly consistent and of a piece. I mean, there are distinctive differences. I'm not casting the entire argument in mold, but it's not particularly ultra or foreign to the discourse as I think in your book you kind of intimated it might be, because a lot of these claims are being made from the other side by folks who style themselves to be critical race theorists.
Yeah,
right. I mean, the Smithsonian Institute's kind of at this point infamous thing identified all sorts of as cultural aspects that you would describe as Western individualist,
That's
nuclear
right.
family, delayed gratification, sense of timeliness. They define them all as white and bad. But
Yeah.
then you, taking a largely similar conceptual frame, declare them to be, not white but Western, and not bad but perhaps particularly suited to success in a bourgeois market economy.
Yeah.
Then you play a very dangerous game of being canceled, despite the fact that there are differences in what is being claimed to some degree, but it's broadly not a totally foreign argument, depending on the valences that are put to it and the kind of categories that are put over it.
Yeah. I think that's accurate. In fact, that's been my own perception, that identity politics and critical race theory express the essential pessimism of the non-Western world about the capacity of individuals to make their way in life. And on the other side, the Western temperament is optimistic and assumes that it's possible for people to achieve their own goals, or at least to orient to those goals. Doesn't mean that they always succeed. They may not succeed. But despite that, a culture that has this inner driven quality has a quality of dynamism and progress, which is not possible in the non-Western viewpoint. This is not to say that the non-Western viewpoint doesn't have its own virtues, because it does. There are very definite things which the non-Western worldview is able to do that the West does not do. And I'm quite explicit about that. I don't think there's anything necessarily superior about the non-West, or rather about the West. But you can say this, and I go into the book as to why this is true, that Western temperament is unusually good at generating wealth and power. And that is primarily because individuals assign to themselves the capacity to improve the world. It could be in a very small way or in a larger way, but they're not content. They expect to get somewhere and do something, which is not given to them by their initial situation in life. And that isn't normal. I mean, one of the major points of the book and the research that I rely on is that the Western temperament is actually not dominant in the world. Quite the contrary. The Western world is a very small part of humanity. And the majority of human beings in this world are engaging in survival. They're seeking to get through life, and their temperament is very much that of the non-West, as I've described it. And there's, of course, a great deal of diversity within both the West and the non-West, and especially the non-West. You have various worldviews which have developed, which are often very interesting, very important, intellectually substantive, and all that. But in the end, they are essentially passive. They accept life as it is, and they think that is what people have to do to get through life. And the West somehow, and I have a chapter about how it arose, the West somehow came to a much more optimistic view about what life's about. And that view, according to the historians, is the essential reason why Europe and then America and other offshoots of Europe came to dominate the world. I mean, I find this a remarkable thing, that this cultural difference is actually the reason why the West, this very small part of humanity, has ended up running the world, at least in the most conspicuous ways. And I find that quite remarkable. And it's also remarkable that no one has really focused on this as a reason for our current difficulties. I mean, do you find that persuasive?
Largely, and for the most part, but there's one thing that you said that I want to press you on, not because I dispute or disagree, but just because you've spent more time studying foreign cultures than I have, and I want to hear you reflect on this question, right? What you said earlier was that in your view, identity politics, critical race theory is kind of channeling certain kind of social pathos pathologies that are nascent in much of the Western world.
Yes.
From my perspective, it strikes me, and I'm not learned enough to render a full and final judgment. I just want to hear you reflect a little bit more about it. That when identity politicians, critical race theorists, talk about viewing things through the lens of CRT, that is a profoundly distorting lens that has its roots in kind of Marxist postmodernist ideology, and therefore is not a reliable filter through which one can actually, understand, see receive a general feeling for non-Western culture. So, kind of want to hear
Yeah.
you reflect a little more on how valid of a lens you think it is to kind of what's on the cultural other side.
Maybe the reason why it's distorting, and I agree with you, is there's a mixed message in the critical race theorists and identity politics. They themselves are quite assertive. They themselves actually express the Western temperament in a rather impressive way. The advocates who stand for these theories, I find to be rather talented, and they've achieved remarkable goals. They are, in fact, pursuing the Western thing, which is to seek, to use a religious phrase, to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. They are doing that. They are, in fact, models of the temperament that their groups should adopt in order to get ahead in America. But although that's true, the message they give is deeply pessimistic because it says the group is trapped within institutions which are in some way racist. Now we speak of structural racism because we can't really find much of the old-fashioned racism where people had derogatory views of minorities. That has pretty well passed away as far as we can tell. We don't find white people today who are racist in the sense they were 50 or 100 years ago. That's really quite uncommon. But the white world is still alienated from the non-West, primarily because the non-Western groups don't show the inner-driven character that they themselves, the white groups, find to be normal. And so they don't get along, and there's a lack of essential trust, which is, I think, the reason why we don't have more integration among the groups. And so the message is pessimistic, even though the style is optimistic. So I think there's something confusing about the message. And that's why critics of critical race theory come back at them rather strongly, and they try to argue with the theory on the merits. But what we should really be looking at is the cultural assumptions and really the psychology behind this theory, because it is what's destructive about it is pessimism. The fact that it tells the non-Western groups, and especially blacks, that they really have no hope in this society, that they're going to be second-class citizens no matter what they do. And that isn't true. I mean, the irony is that there's actually blacks have had quite a bit of success in America, but they've had it by adopting an individual's viewpoint, which was not originally native to the group. I mean, how do you take that? Do you see the same ambivalence in the message?
Well, I agree in part, and then kind of want to push you a little bit further on this theme. I mean, it is in some ways the critical race theorists who are at the forefront of pushing this set of ideas into academia, into culture, are operating, I think, within an entirely Western individualist paradigm par excellence. I mean, it is difficult to think about people who are more, to use the terminology of your book, moralistic, and more individually assertive, group collectively assertive, trying to reshape the culture around them in their own image as this group of scholars and the activists around them. So in a way, it is a very funny mixed thing because their whole worldview and operation is thoroughly within this kind of Western individualist paradigm that you're discussing. On the other hand, what the upshot of such an aggressive and moralistic pessimism is a forthright attack on all of those values and all of those assumptions, and all those assertions. So the one thing that I wanted to ask you about because introduction to your book was published about 2 years ago now, and I'm curious if your mind has changed on it to any degree, or if your thinking is modified. But you identified in your mind kind of the key problem facing America in particular, and the West by somewhat of extension, as being the demoralization or the lack of adoption of this Western individualist ethos by the poor and increasing numbers of the lower working class. I'm curious if you still see that as the number one threat, or if it has come to the point where you view this kind of inverted moralistic elite culture as being a greater threat to both kind of America individually and how we act in the world.
You've hit on some of the complexity in the argument. In the book, I do emphasize that some parts of a traditionally European population in America, particularly the low-educated white men, are essentially abandoning an individualist culture and going over to a life of survival, more tuned to the non-West. That's true. And it actually supports my argument because it shows that there's no necessary correlation between race and culture. These
Right.
men are whites. They come from a European background. But in their current situation, they find it impossible to go on living a goal-directed life. And so they basically give up and they retire from the workplace and from other places they may have been trying to achieve things and go over to a life of simply of endurance from day to day. Conversely, among blacks, you have, I would estimate, about a third of the group has gone over to an individualist culture and is doing rather well. They have found it possible to get ahead precisely because they adopt the attitude that it is possible to pursue goals. And that it just doesn't mean that you have an easy time or that you necessarily succeed, but your life is oriented around those goals rather than around survival from day to day. So those, I don't think that anything that's happened in the last 2 years would make either of those trends less prominent. I think we see a disillusionment among low-skilled white men, and we also see continuing progress by the more individualistic blacks, who are some of whom, of course, are conservatives and who would reject everything said by the advocates. I'm thinking of your colleague Ian Rowe, who I'm going to have on this show at some point in the future. I mean, he's an example of a thoroughly individualist black man who has achieved quite a bit because he doesn't think that he's limited by the fact of who he is. Rather, he is making headway against challenges which he himself has decided. And that is typical of I have several other black friends and associates, and they're just like that. They're inner-driven overachievers, just like me. And this gets to another theme in the book, and that is those who are individualists are actually not free in the sense of just being carefree. On the contrary, their lives are dominated by their obligations. So actually, freedom in the American version, anyway, is a life of obligation rather than a life of a carefree detachment. Quite the contrary. I mean, you're the same way. You're pursuing a set of agendas that have to do with primarily the culture of education, as I understand it, and that has caused you to bear heavy obligations as well. You're pursuing a mission, and you have opponents who have other ideas, and you engage with them, and there's debate, and the debate is crucial to shaping the policy agenda in that area. I mean, this is what I did in the area of welfare reform, going back now into the 80s, 90s. During that time, I was working primarily on the problem of how to get there to be any obligation at all in the welfare system. So it should not simply be a set of rights and claims, but a set of obligations corresponding to the rest of American life. And we did make some success in instituting welfare reform, and that argument was persuasive. And now, of course, we've gone backwards. Now the Biden administration and Congress has essentially repealed welfare reform, and we're now back to a life of entitlement where families get a guaranteed income regardless of what they're doing, and that is, I think, a huge mistake. And other people at AEI agree with me. So, but the basic way of life that leads to that kind of argument is the thing that we're really interested in here. And in the education world, what I find interesting about it is that the most successful reforms we've seen, and I'm thinking here of the primarily of the leading charter schools, what they show is a crucial determination that they're going to make children ready to live a free life. And they do this by at the level that these children come to them. They are essentially teaching them what they ought to have learned in the family. But of course, the families have fallen apart in much of these in these groups, blacks especially, and Hispanics. You have a situation where the majority of the families are single parent, and the fathers have disappeared, and the children experience a family where the parents are engaged in survival rather than in achieving anything. And so when they go to school, they think that's what they're supposed to do there, is just kind of get through it. But in the top charter schools, what we find is an insistence on good behavior, on meeting definite standards. It's the furthest thing from carefree, quite the contrary, highly structured. But what those teachers are trying to teach the students is a set of inner reflexes that will keep them out of trouble when they leave school and go out into the rest of their lives. And they will only be empowered to achieve anything if they first of all stay out of trouble. And that's essentially what those schools are doing, and they're quite successful at it. They're getting the students to internalize a set of skills and reflexes that allow them then to go forward and ask, what do I want to do in my life? And then of course they have much better chance to succeed than if they went to an ordinary school where the whole pattern of the school is simply getting through rather than preparing for a life of freedom. I mean, would you say that's a fair contrast?
To some extent, but there's a nuance or a complication, a twist or a turn, perhaps, that I want to describe and then throw back at you. I mean,
sure.
I think that the description that you gave was broadly true 5 years ago and is still true in some charter schools, in some charter school networks. You know, Success Academy, as an example, if you weren't already planning on it, my colleague Robert Bendicio wrote a fantastic book about that highly successful charter school network that I think would be, you know, a very good fit for this podcast. And
I've invited him.
Yeah, he, you know, what his thesis is in micro, I'll hopefully let him speak to it more, is that what Success Academy did was it created this culture, these expectations, and then for the students who wanted it, for the families who wanted to push their children to reform themselves to fit the culture, it was dramatically successful. And for students who couldn't make it fit, families who didn't have it, they frankly cycled out. And so you had an engine of cultural transmission.
Yes.
That through, you know, frankly, cultural selection for people who believed enough in the broader value proposition to stick with it, was able to give them those great returns. But in the past couple of years, we've seen charter school networks that, you know, would have fit your bill 5 years ago turn on themselves culturally and ideologically. You know, we've seen most notably the Knowledge is Power preparatory schools declare that their old motto of work hard, be nice, which you would describe as a Western individualist paradigm, that is a, you know, sign of anti-blackness and white supremacy. And therefore, it should no longer be the motto, the spirit, the culture of that charter school network. And this is what I kind of, you know, want to press you on at least to consider a little bit more, or to hear you talk a little bit more, because I don't, in my earlier comment, I was not, you know, indicating that the trends that you identified have gone away in the past 2 years by any means. I think they've continued, if not accelerated. But what I do feel as though has changed is, you know, 5 years ago, 7 years ago, when my colleague here at AEI, Charles Murray, wrote Coming Apart, he coined this term of inverted hypocrisy, right? Of, you know, usually we think of hypocrisy as telling somebody to do a good thing while we do a bad thing. And his coin was, you know, kind of telling somebody to do a bad thing while we do a good thing privately. That seems to have switched to the point where the people who run institutions like the Knowledge Power preparatory schools, the people who run major school districts, many people at colleges, a lot of culture makers, are no longer kind of passive inverted hypocrites. They're actively trying to tear down in a way, in a classically Western individualistic and certainly very moralistic way, the key drivers of what can be called kind of Western individualism. And I wonder, like, if and when that becomes, in your mind, a terminal threat, right? I mean, the old paradigm, the old cultural paradigm, and you know, you can see it reflected in mean, you can see it reflected in McGuffey readers in America, and
Correct.
kind of British imperialist poets like Kipling. Of these are our morals, these are our values. Our morals and values are good, and other people should adopt them.
Well,
now we seem to have like inverted that. These are our morals, these are our values, but they're bad, and everybody should denounce them.
it's true. I guess in some ways, others have said this, but in some ways, the surprising thing, I think you're right. White leadership has ceased to assert its own values. Charles Murray's phrase is, they no longer preach what they practice. And I think that's right. And you have to ask why. I don't really know the ultimate reason. Actually, I do. In terms of my book, I would say that reflects Western moralism. Western moralism carried to excess, where you tear down your own house in order to defer to others, and you allow them to dominate you at the expense of your own values. You are, in fact, allow yourself to be destroyed if necessary. There's a novel, I'm trying to think of the author now. It's called The Camp of the Saints. It's a French novel about the invasion of the Western world by people from India who are simply desperately poor and seeking to escape their miserable condition. And they get on ships and they come to France and they invade France and the rest of the Western world and essentially destroy it. But what's striking about it is that church people, church leaders, bishops and others, feel that they have to support this, even though it's the end of their civilization and everything that they have believed in is destroyed. Because they think they should mortify themselves for people who are less fortunate. And the thing they can't do is make any expectations for those groups. That they can't do that at all. They must simply destroy themselves for the others. I actually wrote a couple of books about this, about the feeling that we can never set any expectations for the poor, that they are simply miserable victims of an unjust society. And so all we can do is give them things. And in this case, we give them ourselves and everything we have and allow it to be destroyed. And I mean, there is a long-term problem, which I don't get into in this book, and maybe I need to write another book, about how to maintain any social standards in the presence of the Bible. Because the Bible does indeed argue for forgiveness, for leniency, for an understanding of people who are less fortunate, and that's true in the Old Testament and the New Testament. How then can you maintain any social standard? But in the traditional world, where none of this was questioned, you mentioned Rudyard Kipling. He clearly is an example of this. The whole Victorian order was based upon a notion that there were absolutely clear rights and wrongs in the Western tradition. But if you read it a certain way, you can argue just the opposite, and that's what we see in the camp of the saints. We see the destruction of the West by its own moralism. So that is, I think, what the leaders are doing. What they haven't found is a way to reassert their own values, which are in fact essential to what America has achieved. And they are therefore, I think, condoning the potential destruction of the culture. No, obviously, I'm very much opposed to that, but I haven't yet solved the problem of how you justify it in the face of our traditions. You see, this isn't a problem for the non-West. The non-West doesn't have the same moralism. It has a moral structure in that you're supposed to do good and help others, and the moral commandments at a practical level are very similar to what you find in the West. But what they don't argue for is immolation. They don't argue for self-destruction. They don't argue for what I would describe as a massive act of condescension. I mean, the great fact about the Western leaders confronted with critical race theory is the massive condescension of their response. It's to be very disturbing that the advocates who oppose them and who make demands on them don't see this. They don't see that very few of the Western leaders who are bemoaning their own racism really believe that racism is the source of all Black problems. I don't think they really believe that. I think this is deeply dishonest. This isn't what they believe. And if they were truly caring about those they're speaking to, they would in fact say this. They would in fact be critical. They would do just what Murray says they don't do. They would in fact assert their own norms. And the day is coming when they're going to have to do that. They're going to have to stand up and be counted. And they're going to have to dare to be called racist. That has to be something that really, I'm ready to, I run that risk already. I've been running it for 20 years, more than that. I don't think I'm a racist, and I don't care if anybody calls me a racist. We ought to ask them, what are you doing to really help your people? Do you really want them to live in a country that doesn't have an individualist culture? Because I mean, the logical sense would be that people who fear racism so much, they simply go to another country. But of course, they don't want to do that. They want to stay right here because they value the things that come from the individual's culture, because it does indeed produce a life of enormous wealth. And it also produces good government. And one of the great arguments in my book, I don't think anyone else has ever said this quite clearly, that the Western world, though it's a culture of freedom, is also a culture of strong government. And you have to ask how that's possible. How is it possible for a country that believes in freedom to have this enormously powerful regime which can do things that are beyond any other government? And that's only possible because part of the individual's ethos is, in fact, this strong commitment to moral values, to especially the civic values, the willingness to obey government when it's correct, to pay taxes, to obey the law, and so on and so on. That is what gives us the regime we have. It's not free. It really isn't. It requires a deep commitment to those civic values. And so the critics don't want to give that up. But meanwhile, white leaders are talking as if everything they've done is racist. Well, it is racist in the sense that it's not something that occurred in non-Western cultures. In that sense, it's racially defined because it's coming out of a white society. But according to my sources, it isn't relevant that those people are white. What is relevant, that they adopted this attitude of inner-driven purpose and moralism centuries ago. And how that came about, I have a whole chapter on that. That's a great mystery, how that came about. But if we're going to have a society which has the qualities most of us want, we have to preserve that culture. We cannot simply abandon it because it seems racist to some people. And that's what we're talking about. The advocates are really arguing for the destruction of the thing that created the world that they want to inherit, the world they want to be at ease in. But they can't be at ease unless they're willing to take on the burdens of freedom. I mean, that is my conclusion. I don't think they have an easy task. I don't think, even if they gave up the claims they're making, which are quite unreasonable, it wouldn't mean that blacks who had easy road. On the contrary, they have a very difficult road. They have to take on a lifestyle of inner-driven moralism. That's hard. And it isn't part of their original formation. They have to do this. That's why I'm so impressed by the black middle class, because they have done this. They have shown that it can be done. And of course, people like that are the people that destroyed Jim Crow and are responsible for the civil rights movement. I mean, their achievements are immense, but they were only possible because these people shouldered the burdens of freedom. And the non-West doesn't do that. The non-West shoulders the burden of necessity. Basically, what they do is deal with the demands made on them by the environment, but they don't make demands on themselves. And the great fact about the West is that the dominant demands are internal; they're not external. You see that? And that's actually what the charter schools are saying. They're imposing good behavioral norms on people. Yes, you have to behave well, but after that, it's up to you. You have to decide what you want.
Yeah.
And those burdens are the heaviest. I mean, the burdens I choose, the burdens you choose are the heaviest.
Yeah, and for making those demands, those impositions, they are labeled, as a culturally imperialist institution, which, frankly, part of the reason or part of the phenomenon of why it's so hard to argue against this kind of ideology is because in a way they have a descriptive point. I mean, it is an effort to inform a culture into people who might not necessarily have that same set of values and assumptions and
Yep.
drives built into their home. And so, the other side has kind of claimed by claiming the definition of it, they have also claimed it to be inherently problematic. Whereas on our side, there's this kind of tap dance. We'd like to say that these are not, we'd like to kind of deny the question of cultural particularism or cultural promulgation, and deny that these charter schools are an inherently kind of quote unquote imperialist or engine of change. And then you lose the argument because it's clear that one side is closer to the social definitions, the actual state of affairs. The side who's against it is closer to the reality than the side who wants to defend it, which does not allow itself to tap into the same set of vocabulary.
I think you're right to say that they've come up with an argument that's hard to answer, or I don't find it hard to answer. I'm coming from this cultural viewpoint, which is, to me, quite sufficient to understand what's going on here. They are, in fact, defeatists. They believe that it's not possible for people who are non-white to pursue a life of purpose in this society. Well, that's false. That's simply false. It doesn't mean it's easy. On the contrary, in some ways, the life of improvisation, of simple survival, that isn't an easy life either. You got a choice of evils here. Either you deal with a life of external pressures, which is what I think most poor people and most minorities are doing. They're, in fact, living lives of improvised adjustment from day to day. Okay, that's a hard life. The life that you and I live, most individuals live, of inner-driven purpose, that's also hard because you have to give up a lot of things in order to pursue your goals. And it's one or the other. You can't really have the life of freedom and affluence and so on that we have without assuming those burdens. And I think that's the mission. And I don't know why we should be squeamish about that. I think we have to say that that's what this is about. One phrase I use is that Western culture is a culture of mastery. It's not a culture of acceptance. It's a life of mastery. Mastery, first of all, over yourself, and then over the adversities you may suffer in achieving your purposes, whatever it is. I have opponents, people who reject everything I say. You have opponents. Frankly, these are people that I want to have. If I didn't have people opposing me, I feel I wasn't getting anywhere. I have to get their attention. We have to engage. We have to get into a struggle, which we hope will lead to consensus. But it's a life of mastery. And certainly, the culture of the West has led to mastery of all kinds of physical and practical challenges, which is why we have the wealth we have and the power that we have. We wouldn't have those things without this culture. And okay, there's a price to be paid. That's true. There is a price to be paid. Freedom isn't free. When the veterans say that, they're quite accurate. And we need to be optimistic about that. But at the same time, there's something glorious about it. Because the great thing about the West is that people triumph over themselves. Essentially, they dedicate their lives to some higher purpose. And there are a lot of people who do that. And I give some examples in the book. People who have been remarkably successful in carving out an achievement of this and that way. And it need not be anything particularly visible. It can be simply doing better for your family, or getting a better house, or a better job. But you work towards that over a period of time. And that's what gives your life meaning. And that isn't normal. You see, I think when the advocates say that there's an imperialism here, I think there's truth to that, in the sense that this temperament isn't normal for most people. But if we want to have the society we have, and we want to have the rewards that come from a life of purpose, then we must bear these burdens. I don't see an alternative to that. And I'm surprised that the leaders are so squeamish. Since my book came out a little over 2 years ago, I haven't been able to, nobody's given me a chance to talk about it in public because it's too threatening. And you see, the universities are now dependent upon a large number of students from the non-Western world. They're either people who are immigrants themselves or children of immigrants, and they bring with them, although they have academic credentials, they bring with them the more passive, more reactive temperament of the non-West. And then someone like me gets up and says, well, that temperament is the reason why your society is where it is and where America is. And they're very different places. And I don't mean one is better than the other, but it isn't obvious how they can all be the same. They really can't be. They have to be different because the way of life is different. And anyway, I guess my question to you would be, you're saying the other side has made a good argument that you find difficult to answer. So what do you say to that? See, when I hear other people struggle with identity politics, I'm struck by the fact that most of what they do against it is simply to repeat its arguments. They end up saying the things that the advocates say, and then they, in some way, in some mild way, say that they're unreasonable or wrong, but they're not really able to make the kind of argument that I'm making, which is at a deeper level, which isn't really about their argument. I'm saying what they're doing is culturally destructive, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. And although we admire how clever they are and how articulate they are, why isn't this simply the bad news? Why don't we simply say this isn't something society can afford? Now, that's not something this society can afford. That would be okay in another society where there's a more attitude towards acceptance. But that's not the American way. The American way is not acceptance. The American way is focus and achievement focus on achieving things that need to be achieved to improve things. So our lives are restless. We're all the time trying to improve things.
Yeah.
Doesn't make for a restful life.
Yeah, no, you've pointed to something that, I can, both from my personal experience and from other, colleagues in the space, as they say, verify, right? There is a sense on the right that the best way to argue back against identity politics and critical race theory is to simply repeat what they're saying back at them loudly enough in public, so that eventually your average people, the normies, as kind of that's colloquially termed, can see what's directly in front of them, what the arguments actually are, and that they will be naturally turned off by them. That's the theory of action that is, I think, to some extent, hamstringing the response on the right to this. And the reason it doesn't go beyond that is it's a very unpleasant thing to say for all sorts of reasons, but to do more than that, one needs to articulate a positive vision of the human good that, for it to be effective, does, I think, have to go somewhat beyond, the case that the way that you've laid it out in the book and discussing about it of, here are these values, here are those values. One does have to make a claim of the good. One has to claim, take what you were saying and infuse it with a little bit more moral spirit and say that mastery is a good thing. A man or a woman who is most at one with their true nature is a man or a woman who is able to provide for one's family, affect society, be in control of their surroundings. And it's an idea, it's a vision that I think, frankly, would appeal to many college students if they had a professor who was able to say it to them. It would appeal to many high school students if they had a professor, a teacher who was able to say it to them. But unfortunately, in the public sphere, articulating that vision of the good runs the greatest peril of all, because the ultimate moral labels in popular discourse are at this point set by the cultural left, and everything that I was just saying, or other ways I could describe it, will be called white supremacism in a way that has a certain descriptive plausibility of argument. And so to start to make a positive case runs the risk of being thoroughly purged from the left side.
See, it isn't really white supremacy.
It's not. It's not. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying there's a certain
the real supremacy is the culture, not the race. To me, an accident that Europeans are Caucasians or white to look at. Their color is a certain color. To me, that's simply irrelevant. What is important about Europe is that somehow that it fastened on this idea that life can be purposeful. And that simply isn't true in the rest of the world. The rest of the world has other goals and values which are attractive and interesting and valuable in their own right. There's no idea here that those cultures are inferior, quite the contrary. In fact, they're stronger in some ways than the West. I accept that. But the West does have this capacity to pursue goals in ways that make the world better in material senses, especially by developing wealth and power. That is the thing that the wealth has done. And that was not really white supremacy. That was really a cultural supremacy, a culture of mastery focused on, you use the word control. I think that really is fundamental. The great fact is one pursues a life in which one is in control. Now, none of this is ever perfectly in control. You know, I was saying to Michelle 10 minutes before our broadcast started, I lost one of my contact lenses, and I'm searching around my desk to find the contact lens, and I finally found it. None of this is ever perfectly in control, and we all, and I mean, there's an element in the Western mind which is very much focused on humility. We don't ever achieve the things we claim to achieve or hope to achieve. So there's something there's an element of bad news too in the way we go about our lives, and we don't always get what we want. On the contrary, we don't. And there's no idea. And in fact, in those ways, the non-West is stronger. They're able to deal better than we deal with the things that cannot be mastered, which are beyond us. In fact, the recent COVID struggle is an example of that. The COVID pandemic was something we didn't understand and couldn't control for a long time. Now, fortunately, in a way, the Western moralism, the Western mastery, in the end rescued us because it found a way to produce the vaccine. And the vaccine has now saved most of America from that danger. So we still see the mastery operating, but also that there are things that we just don't understand and don't control. And those things, the non-West is better in dealing with those things. So they have much to teach us, and I'm therefore in favor of a multicultural society. I don't believe that the whole country should be dedicated necessarily to an individualist way of life. But that has to remain dominant if we're going to keep the things that we have from that life, which are very valuable, namely wealth and power. And good government. I mean, the fact is America is able to govern and also govern others. We see this right now in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The United States, in leaving Afghanistan, leaves behind a scene of chaos, because that culture, and this is true in much of the non-West, has never been able to develop a strong enough governing philosophy to impose order on a territory. We think that's normal. Not at all normal. It's a great achievement. And we have that. And we have that in a way that is inexplicable if you just think America's about freedom. And so I don't see why we should hesitate to defend the values that make that culture possible. And I don't understand why our leadership, I can well understand our leadership arguing with the advocates in ways that would, I'm sure, be useful for both sides. But the idea that they should grovel at the feet of the advocates and bemoan their own racism, I mean, I find that inexplicable. That it cannot be true that the leaders of our major institutions are racist in the ways they claim to be. That is absurd. It hasn't been true for 50 years. And to say that is, I mean, that's the first criticism I would make of our leaders. They are not honest. They are not, and they are condescending in a massive way to groups that are engaging in destroying the culture. And we should be open to discussing cultural difference. In fact, that's the main point of this podcast, is not to assert necessarily a single right view, but to discuss things in these terms. So we get away from the focus simply on race and racism, which is the way the issue has been cast. That really isn't what we're about. What we're really about is these cultural stakes that we're talking about. So I'm wondering what's your best answer to that. You said that you basically take the view of other conservatives, that you repeat what they claim and then find it to be unreasonable. Is that essentially how one answers?
I mean, that's not my preferred technique. I'm, working on moving past it in certain respects in my writing and in my public presence. The issue is the broader difficulty. I'll bring in. I don't know if this professor, this book is on your radar, but it's informed a lot of my thinking on this subject. Have you read or are you familiar with Joshua Mitchell and his American Awakening?
No.
So I would strongly recommend that you check out the book, think about him as a podcast guest, because to my mind, American Awakening is by, an order of magnitude, the most perceptive tome on identity politics. And it's on some level, the thesis is familiar, which is that it is identity politics is a shunted form of Christianity, which takes the scapegoat out of the eternal and puts it onto a particular group. And, the logic of a scapegoat requires a certain purge for a sense of sin that we culturally cannot escape from. And so the question of where did all the mainline Protestants go? Well, they didn't go anywhere. They just took a bunch of the similar Christian intuitions and politicized them, and that is what we are seeing today. The problem
with that, what I was saying before when talking about the camp of the saints, that you have an excessive moralism that has become self-destructive.
Correct, but the worse than that even, because you pretty nicely kind of put out, and this is like something that I think. Way back in the day, in his own way, Nietzsche argued that because the moral standard of Christianity is so radically high, we will never be able to, as individuals or as a society, live all the way up to it. And after a certain point of time, that becomes impossible to carry forward in a steady, transmissible cultural form. But now we've taken that same intuition and put it into the political realm with groups that carry sin, groups that are blameless, and the process of trying for a social purge, which is pure pre-Christian tribalism in a post-Christian age, is the defining aspect of our society. The difficulty, to take this around to your question, right, is that there are two plausibly effective ways to combat this. The way of simply repeating it back at the other side is actually not one of them. The easiest one, and the one that Mitchell is most concerned about, but I would also say the one that I think that President Trump and the Trumpist phenomenon represented, is what he describes as a willful Nietzschean dismissal of the moral categories whatsoever, right? I mean, this is where you get the Charlie Kirks and the right-wing Twitter people having as their North Star, cry more lives, because the central message that they're trying to put through the culture is that these moral categories that have been set up and accepted by elite polite society, they're wrong. They should hold no value. They should be discredited and demeaned. Problem with that is that doesn't put forward any alternative positive vision. It's an inherently destructive and somewhat nihilistic thing. And so the way to really be able to fight it is to proffer a vision of the good and of the human good, and to claim that some things are better than others, and what you are trying to do for children, for society, hurts.
From a Christian point of view, the question should be, what does the greater good of the other person require? And it isn't necessarily that I immolate myself. It is I do what the other person requires. And when I read stories like Pondicio's book about the success sequence, I see teachers that are providing what these students actually require. They are doing the good for them at some cost to themselves. And I don't see how that isn't the answer. I mean, the real answer to the pessimism of identity politics, strikes me, is that it isn't really the best thing for the people they're claiming to serve. On the contrary, it's profoundly a self-destructive idea that may be comfortable for groups that find achievement difficult, and they do, no question about that. But it's not the answer. The answer is, in fact, to achieve the things one needs to do in order to have a life in this society. And I don't see how that isn't the good here. The fact that it's a culture dominated by white people is, to me, irrelevant. That isn't, its value is still clear for the non-Western groups. And I don't see, and there's nothing that they're offering as an alternative. They're offering, in fact, a life of defeatism. And I don't understand why we can't just say that that's wrong. You have to do what other people require. Now, if they seriously don't want it, that's something else. You don't want to impose it on people. And in Pondicio's book, certainly, the parents who are part of the success system are absolutely committed to their children having this thing that the school provides. Now, you can argue, I think there's a further argument you have to make, which he admits, about the parents that are not so sure and the kids who don't have strong parents behind them and who are themselves rather defeated. I don't know what we do about that necessarily. That's a further argument. But there's absolutely no doubt that this culture is constructed for the people that he's writing about. I don't see why we can't defend that. And the idea that that is somehow racist simply because white people are good at it, there is something ironic, and I have to admit this. If you find yourself, as blacks do, in a society not of their own construction, constructed by other people, that is going to be hard for them. They are going to have to adjust in some way. That's true. However, it is a society with enormous wealth and power. And it's one they prefer to any other society. This is not a group saying they want to go back to Africa or any other place. They want to stay here. So it isn't completely comfortable. I don't see how we can save them from that. That is simply a cost they're going to have to, that's simply the way it is. I mean, I end my book, as in some of my talks, by saying, this isn't a comfortable, this is not the world America wanted. We didn't want to be in charge of helping other people survive, either within the country or outside the country. That isn't what we thought we were about. We were just providing a decent life for our own people who came from Europe. That's what we thought we were doing. In fact, we end up, because of our power, we end up in charge of much of the world. Okay? That's our quarrel is with God. God has set up the world in this way, that we somehow become responsible for everyone. All right, if we are, then we have to say to them, those for whom this is not comfortable, you indeed have to take on the burdens of freedom. That's part of being in this society. I don't see how we can save them from that. Well, the thing we can't do is give them a privilege, simply say, you get all the advantages of living in America without having to bear the burdens of freedom. And you go on continuing to live a life of improvised survival, and yet still get a middle-class income and all the other prerequisites. Apparently, that's what the Biden administration is now trying to do, is to provide a guaranteed life of comfort and security for everybody, whether or not they are part of the individualist society. No, that's unfair. Then you are expecting those who are individualists to bear the burdens for everyone else. No. That's what we decided we weren't going to do in welfare reform, and now we've gone back on it. If that's what Biden really wants, no, that is not fair. We can't expect people to be part of this society and yet not bear the burdens of freedom. There has to be some assimilation in that sense. Okay, I'm afraid to say we're out of time. Let me just ask you any last comments.
No, I mean, I think the conversations are like this are useful because as you laid out, or as we've been kind of dancing around or towards perhaps the most needful thing in American society as a leadership class that has listened to or had enough conversations to feel confident asserting itself and asserting its own values. And
that was the result of this podcast. I'd be delighted. I really would.
So appreciate being able to be a small part of hopefully that project. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks very much, Max, and I'm sure we'll talk again.